Alright y'all, so today in this video, I want to talk about a kind of a really interesting and obscure canceled series that we could have gotten in the early 2010s that definitely would have been fascinating if it ever came out. Of course, for the topic of this video, we're going to be talking about the CW Blue Beetle canceled TV series slash spinoff that we could have gotten that could have possibly came out in the early 2010s. This is kind of an obscure topic, especially if you look into lost superhero media. I didn't even know this was a thing, but apparently at some point the CW almost attempted to make a Blue Beetle TV series. And it's also really fascinating, even more so by the people that were alleged to be involved in this series. So I kind of want to just make this canceled video to discuss it, give you my thoughts on it, talk about the beginnings, the content that we have, which surprisingly enough, we even have some test footage for this proposed series, and it's actually available online. I'm going to kind of talk about that, and then I'm going to talk about possibly why this series was canceled and the ultimate aftermath of this CW canceled Blue Beetle series. So regardless, let's get into it. So this canceled CW Blue Beetle series really has its beginnings with Smallville. Smallville was hugely popular in the 2000s. It was kind of one of the premier TV shows, at least in the later part of the WB network, and eventually that got merged into the CW, and, it was a really popular superhero TV series. And the idea for doing possible other characters, other potential superhero TV shows was kind of running around behind many of the people who worked on the show, but also people on the CW. And eventually the idea of doing a possible Blue Beetle spin-off series happened. This is where the idea kind of started in its origins. Now, it's kind of unclear whether or not this was going to be a Smallville spin-off or its own thing entirely. There's kind of arguments for both here. Now, eventually, Jeff Johns, the future president of DC, actually was involved with this early attempt to get Blue Beetle on the small screen, if you will. He was actually going to be kind of the sort of creative push, the creative director to get this project off the ground. He was apparently supposed to write this series, and he was kind of one of the first people to even talk about it. It was kind of announced way back in the day in 2010, which this is way before Arrow came out, where the concept of the Arrowverse was even formed. So this is still when Smallville was on the air, and the idea of doing a shared continuity of TV shows hadn't yet really fully blossomed. Now, Jeff Johns was apparently working on this project, and eventually there was sort of a test footage created for this proposed TV series, which is actually available on YouTube. It's pretty low quality, but it was released over 15 years ago, so it's kind of, take it for what it is. Now, I was going to focus on the newer version of the Blue Beetle character, Hamin Rans, if I'm saying that name correctly. He's kind of more of the modern version of the character, and obviously my personal favorite version of the Blue Beetle. He's actually one of my favorite characters in the DC continuity in general, really quite underrated. But that being said, Jeff Johns kind of announced this series. He kind of showed off some test steals, if you will, of this test footage online, kind of hyping it up, saying that he was really impressed with what they were able to accomplish. Now, this test footage was apparently created before Blue Beetle would appear in Smallville, and it was only designed as a really just proof of concept. It wasn't really designed to be any kind of real part of any scene or anything, just kind of a proof of concept. Can visually, with a TV show budget, Blue Beetle be accomplished? Now, there would be also a different actor to play Hamin Rans in this little test footage. They would actually cast someone else different for when he would eventually appear in Smallville. And actually, believe it or not, the guy who actually created and directed the Blue Beetle test footage was a guy called Alex Winter. Now, he has directed a few things. He famously directed Bill and Ted, that film from the 90s, a really popular film. But lately, at that point in his career, he had done a lot of the live-action Ben 10 movies. So apparently he did Alien Swarm, and what was the other one? Race Against Time. So, take it would you leave it. But this was apparently the Alex Winter was the guy that directed this test footage, and it was produced through his own production company, Trooper Productions. So it seemed like Alex Winter was going to be involved in this series, possibly a director a few of the episodes, or who knows, maybe even a showrunner alongside Jeff Johns. But it seemed like this was an effort propagated by Johns, possibly other people in Smallville, to get a potential Blue Beetle series off the ground, and a pilot, kind of some test footage directed by Alex Winter. And, there was originally some huge talk about getting this off the ground. Eventually, at Comic-Con in 2010, this entire Blue Beetle test footage was presented by Johns to a crowd of people who apparently were enthusiastic for it. They really enjoyed for what they saw at the time. But eventually, nothing happened after this. Now, what is the test footage itself? Well, it was actually released online. It's kind of a quick scene of basically the Scarab wrapping himself around Hamis. We get a scene of basically him transforming into the Blue Beetle, and then he kind of goes off what it looks like to be Vancouver, but I could be mistaken there. Probably to fight some crime or do some shenanigans. Then he comes back into his room, and his sister checks up on him to figure out what the noise was always, what that weird noise, and kind of checking up on her brother. It could be his mom. I'm not exactly sure. The audio is pretty low. But yeah, that's kind of the end of the pilot. I might put the link down below to kind of show you what it might have looked like. But that's a very brief description of it. And like I said, it was shown off the 2010 Comic-Con by Johns. And, there seemed to be some real effort put into this. But eventually there was kind of no news on this pilot or this test footage or the proposed Blue Beetle spin-off series. At least this version of it. It's kind of unclear whether this would have been connected to Smallville or not. Now, this isn't exactly the end of the story for Blue Beetle on the TV screen and in future adaptations. Eventually, in of course, Smallville, like I already mentioned before, he eventually appeared in episode 18 of season 10, the last season of Smallville, in the episode Booster. And he was played by a different actor than the one we saw in the test footage. I believe the actor's name was Jaron Brant Barrett. And he plays Hami, of course, the version of the character. And it was a proof of concept, if you will, like a lot of other characters that appeared on Smallville. And years later was kind of confirmed by the director of the episode, Tom Welling, which, yes, Tom Welling did direct that episode. But yeah, Blue Beetle did eventually make it to the small screen and got introduced to the audiences through Smallville. And the episode was also written by Jeff Johns, so that's a pretty interesting thing to note. Now, apparently, years later, I guess in 2024, Tom Welling was asked about the episode, either on a podcast or someone, most likely Mike and Rosenberg's podcast, but I'm just kind of assuming there. But apparently, the episode Booster was intended to be a backdoor pilot for the Blue Beetle spinoff. And yeah, apparently the episode was intended to be, like I said, a sort of lead-in to a possible spinoff of Smallville. This version was probably going to be most likely helmed and written by Jeff Johns. Maybe Alec Winter was going to be involved, and, was intended to be a launch board for that series. And that's it. That's all the information we basically know. Ultimately, there was no news, and eventually the Blue Beetle shows seemingly got canceled. The spinoff from Smallville, or just the standalone CW version of the show, both versions got scrapped. And eventually, Blue Beetle as a character, he wouldn't exactly die. He would appear in other iterations of DC media. He appeared in Young Justice, and eventually in 2023, got his own film that's set in James Gunn's DCU. And I gotta be honest with you, pretty damn good movie. Really enjoy that. But yeah, that's basically all the information I was able to find and collect on the CW, Blue Beetle spinoff series. But yeah, my thoughts on this could have been, could this series have been any good? Could have been a really interesting spinoff to Smallville or even a standalone series. My thoughts on this. I think this series was pretty disappointing. We never got it to some degree. I think Jeff Johns writing it and possibly being a major force in its creation, I think would have elevated the show's quality a little bit higher compared to other future CW superhero shows. So I think it's a bit disappointing we never at least got a pilot. That being said, the Alex Winter directed test footage, while it's low quality and it's not exactly great, I think the elements of something great is there. I think the concept could be a really great TV show. But I do think the visual effects were not quite there for Blue Beetle, at least in 2010, with a CW TV show budget. While I don't hate the test footage, I think it looks a bit janky and a bit weird in certain aspects. And, I just think some of the CGI is very hit and miss. And, when he eventually did appear on the small screen in Smallville, I think that the potential there was also, really cool. But I think the execution of Blue Beetle in Smallville was a mixed bag. I think the suit looked kind of cheap. It felt like they were trying to do an Iron Man kind of thing with the suit. And that's not exactly how Blue Beetle is in the comics, which is more of a skin-tight kind of metallic metal suit, which is something I don't think the show really accomplished. So I think in a lot of ways, I think writing-wise, the show could have been pretty cool, but I don't know if visually they could have exactly, accomplished Blue Beetle on the small screen, as well as they eventually did in the 2023 movie. So I think it's a little bit of a hit and miss in terms of my opinions on this show. I think it would have been good, but I think visually it might have struggled, and some of the effects probably would have dated themselves pretty badly if it moved forward. But I also think it's a little bit of a shame we never even got to see any kind of spinoff from Smallville get greenlit. So I think it kind of sucks, personally. I think that this series definitely had potential, but maybe it was a little bit ahead of its time. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the CW Blue Beetle canceled spinoff series that almost happened in the early 2010s that either would have been its own thing or a spinoff from Smallville. Alright, y'all, hopefully y'all enjoyed this video. Just kind of wanted to give you my thoughts on this kind of obscure canceled series that we could have gotten. Hopefully y'all have a good day, and peace, y'all.